Alright, we're back for what's going to be the last video of the series. If you haven't watched the previous videos, then I highly recommend you go check them out, as they will give you the full context required. Now, I say that this will be the last video in this series very purposely. While there is more than enough content to carry another 20 episodes, I think it's critical that there is an end. And to explain why, I need to take you on a journey. Shortly after finishing the last video, I started playing Stellar Blade, right? And damn. I mean, what a game. It's not a perfect game by any means, but a game doesn't need to be perfect to be brilliant. It's like how sometimes getting a cheeseburger when you really want one outweighs the value of getting a $100 steak that you enjoy, but bite after bite you find yourself in an internal battle trying to justify the cost per bite. And you know what? While I'm playing Stellar Blade, I don't think about censorship. I don't think about who said what to who. I don't think about feminism. I'm frankly too busy playing dress-up dolls and finding soda cans. I mean, look at this. It's freaking adorable. So part 1 is coming back to the core of the hobby and what makes it great, and yeah, it's absolutely worth defending, but there is a point where I think it's healthy to disconnect. And the other part of it is that you cannot fight hate with hate, because it simply breeds more of it, and you have to wonder that if you push back for long enough, do you not just become the thing you set out to fight against in the end? Don't get me wrong, it's fine to be outraged for a period, it's fine to boycott something and reject it indefinitely, but I think it's not as difficult as one might think to fall into a position where you are now seeking to oppress a group of people because some individuals within that group did something hateful, and so you assign blame to that collective, draw a battle line, and create a call to action. Oops, who's the extremist now? Now, don't get it twisted, I signed the petition to uncensor Stellar Blade. I continue to stand by everything I said. I will more than likely not play many games that have a perceived bend towards forced DEI. But much like a toxic ex, you cannot keep answering their calls and responding to their texts. It always reaches a point where it's best to block them and move on. I hope you get the heart of what I'm saying here. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. There are literally hundreds of examples in history of one group pushing back on another group, only for the other group to then push back more violently, and so on and so forth. I want to warn against creating the next generation of Alyssa Mercantes and Anita Sarkeesians, but more importantly, life is too short to be bitter, and I would hate the idea of setting any of my viewers down that kind of path. So with that out of the way, let's end the series with a bang. You might recall last episode we deconstructed the Sweet Baby Inc. Detected Curator page, some of the Gamergate 2 articles, Sweet Baby Inc. itself, DEI, and how the demo for Stellar Blade became this battleground over which journalists and gamers chose to fight over. Even though like half of them aren't gonna play the game, but whatever. Now that's a lot, but GDC, or the Game Developers Conference in 2024, also happened right before the demo dropped. You might recall that I used a clip of people screaming in a park. Yeah, so that was the Game Developers Conference this year. Now, I don't have the money or the will to go to something like the GDC conference. It's halfway around the world. But I think if you ever needed to highlight the disparity between what game journalists say about the gaming industry and what games industry says about the gaming industry, then I'd say the GDC is likely a good way to do it. After all, most of the evidence that points towards Sweet Baby Inc. being a bad actor comes from GDC. Here's a tweet that exposes some of the talking points. To quote, "End white cisgender able-bodied man as the default." End quote. It's awfully specific, isn't it? Why would you care about the race, gender, and ability of a video game character? Or even more so, the race, gender, and ability of a video game character that isn't fixed? How does this make video games better exactly? Because I genuinely wonder if anyone boots up a game, sees a character creator, and then thinks, damn, not my race, gender, or ability, I'm out, and then closes the game down. And if there are people out there that are like this, then why would you seek them out as your customer? Now look, I'll admit that I am reading this with a bit of bad faith, because I know what they are really saying is much worse. What they want to do is shift the core demographic of gaming to focus on what they deem to be marginalized groups. It's not really all that different from what Kim Belair was saying all the way back in 2019 when she gave her speech, and there is an eerie consistency not only to the message, but also the venom that underpins it. You could easily change the title to something like why shifting the video game demographic is important, but that's too subtle. The temptation to let the mask slip a little is just too great. Belair could have done her entire speech without the picky baby analogy, which was a terrible analogy, and this speaker didn't need to be so specific, but and this is just my opinion, I think when you really hate someone, or a group of people, it sort of just slips out from time to time. Let's read on to quote, "Video games are political. The way we make games is political. The way we teach our students to make games is political." End quote. This old chestnut. It's an annoying statement because it's technically true in the pedantic sense, but the weight given to it is overstated and pales in comparison to simply writing good stories and making good games. Really, this is just a straw man, because admittedly when gamers say, "I want my games to be apolitical," what they really mean is, "I don't want to be lectured in my entertainment time." And that doesn't mean that a game cannot be political, far from it. The problem is that there is a tendency for developers to lean so far into a political message that they actually handcuff themselves from having diversity in their narratives, as far as to the point where they cannot invite the audience to contemplate the question behind the message or decide where they stand in relation to it. And of course, when these writers start from a position of a political statement, they are also then forced to construct a straw man within their narrative so they can attack it with the utmost objectivity, and it leads to what can best be described as a kind of political porn that only appeals to the single ideology it stems from. It is at its very core exclusionary. Now this is fine, perhaps this wasn't the main topic at GDC or something, but I think the bigger point of concern here is that Xbox released the Gaming for Everyone product inclusion framework for game developers on March 20th. Oh boy. You have to remember that this comes right before the Stellblade demo release, but after all the articles that try to convince you that DEI isn't some grand mandate. Well, Xbox chimed in with "This is our framework of suggestions for game developers that we use in-house. By the way, we own half of all developers." So let's have a read on what this is about. To quote, "In 2019, we created what is now known as the Gaming for Everyone product inclusion framework. Xbox has been using and evolving this framework internally since then, and is thrilled to offer it to anyone to use starting today. The framework focuses on 4 key areas, or what we call doorways. Approachability, which ensures all players, existing and new, experienced and novice, feel safe and welcome. Representation is about reflecting the diversity of the player and creator community so everyone can feel that they belong. Globalization is about making global players feel at home and ensuring that their experience has local relevance and respect. Accessibility is about making games and experiences playable for people with disabilities and striving to make products accessible by design from the ground up. Together, we call these inclusive growth doorways, which are the foundational element to the product inclusion framework. We use the metaphor of doorways because gaming has often been considered a doorway to another world, but for some, those doorways have been closed or even locked." End quote. Now look, on the surface that's admirable, but as with all things, the devil is in the details. I want to preface this by explaining exactly how this works because it is simple but very effective. Almost everyone has an innate desire to be seen as good, to be fair. We want to be desirable to be around because, let's face it, things get pretty bad for you on an individual level if you cannot find a place where you are valued in this world. This is, however, counterbalanced by our own personal well-being. What is the opportunity cost of taking an action that will potentially improve my standing in society versus my own well-being? This is why you see things like virtue signaling online. There are millions of people that will support Ukraine, Palestine, Russia, or Israel with their mouth or behind a screen, but realistically, once it costs money, this number goes down. And then if you take into account the people that have actually gone to the affected areas to help those people groups, it is a minuscule fraction. So guess what runs companies like Microsoft? That's right, people. So companies also engage in trying to carve a space in our social pecking order, though their desire to be seen as good does not stem from the individual desire we have. Rather, it's a purposeful hijacking of what is a fundamental human attribute. Now, it might be true that individuals within a corporate environment do align with said values, and this generally has a snowballing effect, but at the end of the day, these are businesses, not people. And yes, it's gross when individuals signal and are then found to be without merit, but it is deeply undermining when it is done on a corporate level because it most often delegitimizes the cause they attach themselves to when inevitably it comes to light that they never cared about said cause to begin with. What they are trying to do is take an idea that is objectively just and then use it as a Trojan horse for profit. Also works great when you mess up. What's that? Another Blizzard lawsuit? Well, we're proud to announce our new disabled Overwatch hero. It's the first ever video game character that fights from a wheelchair, and so on and so forth. If a company professes to hold a principle dear, but then folds its valued principle at the cent of profit, then it was not a gift, it was a Trojan horse. Now here's the best part. Publicly traded companies have a fiduciary responsibility to investors to generate profit. It is logically impossible for a publicly traded company to take a principled stance that isn't also a popular stance. And when said popular stance goes out of fashion, well, guess what? That matter of utmost importance from a month ago is no longer the principle that company cares for. Now, this is also largely true for private companies, though there is more wiggle room. But the point is that when a company suddenly aligns its principles with yours, it isn't your ally, it is more that you are its new preferred host. Now let's talk about Microsoft. I know that a lot of people grew up with Halo. I know a lot of people really like Xbox consoles and their services, and the same goes for PlayStation, Nintendo, yada yada yada. So anyways, Microsoft has never been at the top of the console market. Even in the US, Xbox is not the dominant platform, and when you consider that the next highest profit margins are in China, Japan, and South Korea, yeah, I don't think that they're getting a strong foot in those markets for quite some time, as long as Nintendo and Sony have anything to say about it. And yes, while Microsoft's acquisition of Activision King changes a lot in terms of profits, it's important to remember that these are use it or lose it investments. Or in other words, if the acquisitions keep exhaling dud games like they are, then these profitable acquisitions are slowly going to turn into debts as the inbuilt demographics become disenfranchised and leak into other systems. All in all, the big console platforms are in a battle for demographics. What they want is a way to put a store page in your home, and Sony and Nintendo already have a firm grip on the majority of the current player base. So it is only natural that Microsoft, or any other company for that matter, will compete, not only for the current player base, but also to widen the demographic. For example, Microsoft might not own your console, but they kind of own your PC. So Game Pass is a great way to put a store in your home and also incentivize you to go there if you don't own a console. Another cheap way of expanding the demographic is to reach for marginalized groups by supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion. I say it's cheap, not because it's bad to cater to marginalized groups, but rather that it is an easy checkbox to say that you care, but you aren't willing to investigate the effectiveness of your strategies in hindsight. Not to get biblical, but you know a tree by its fruit. What is the fruit? I'll let you answer that for yourself. Now, coming back to the Xbox framework, here's the tagline. To quote, "If we don't intentionally include, we unintentionally exclude." End quote. Sounds great until you realize that the words include and exclude are not synonymous with positive and negative attributes. Example, if we don't intentionally include Hitler, we unintentionally exclude Nazis. As you can see, what exactly is being included and excluded is very important in gauging the value behind the words. There are also some demographics that are highly antagonistic, and it's simply not possible for them to coexist. For example, you cannot intentionally include trans people and trans exclusionary radical feminists, and I don't think that you should ever try. All in all, it's just word salad that is supposed to be vaguely uplifting and sound like a proverb, but what it really means is, if we don't intentionally include trending DEI, we unintentionally exclude trending DEI, and that's really where it ends. Throughout this framework, we're going to see the same diversity chart parroted to show you how important diversity is, but if you look at the fine print, you can see that this is a study by Google for Games, and if you look at the report itself, it's tied to Google's DEI in gaming program that wants you to take a pledge to embrace DEI. To quote, "A global gaming audience demands diverse companies, content, and perspectives. Take the pledge." End quote. Furthermore, the sample size is a measly 14,356 participants, speaking on behalf of the apparent 3 billion gamers worldwide. Even when Quantic Foundry did its study on the gender split back in 2017, they were able to get 270,000 participants, and this was simply by hosting an online questionnaire. It begs the question as to how Google, of all places, struggled to find participants, but we will never know because unlike the Quantic Foundry study, they don't tell you how they go about selecting participants. What is even more troubling is that while this report is titled PC and Console Insights Report 2022, for the question, what features are PC and console players interested in engaging with in new games, one of the possible answers is, quote, "performance on low-end / less powerful phones." End quote. Which makes me think that this was a survey for phone games where you select your primary and secondary device at the beginning of the survey and they just filtered out everyone that didn't list console or PC as their primary device. Because I don't think that 28% of PC and console gamers care about their PC and console games running on low-end phones. Also worth noting that the diversity options are shared answers to pad their importance. For example, wanting more diverse character creation options is not inclusive of wanting more diverse characters, but the survey does not let you make that distinction. If you want to wear a top hat in a game, you also want your character to be a marginalized ethnic representative, apparently. Also, new technology and diverse gameplay is a single option. So if you want to use DLSS 4, you also want platforming puzzles in your first-person shooter. Once you start using examples, the pairings become grossly dishonest. Notice that the use of the word diversity is actually used in multiple different contexts in the survey, but only represented as race, sex, ethnicity, and ability in the results. So yeah, if you exclude the padded answers, you actually end up with recognition of competitive play at the top of the graph. Just saying, Battlefield. I could make a whole video about the problems with this study, and I read this report for about 5 minutes. Coming up with the statistics to justify the Microsoft inclusion framework is part of someone's full-time job. Don't fool yourself. Microsoft could do their own study if they really cared, but they don't really care. They only care that you see their input as valuable to society, so you will choose to spend your money with them. It's not just Google though. Here's a Newzoo study. Microsoft also uses Newzoo. The title says, to quote, "Most gamers think diversity matters and that share increases with each new generation." End quote. So this is one of those agree, completely agree, disagree type questions. The statement is actually, diversity in games is important to me. Of course, I want a forest, desert, and frozen biome in my games too. Just kidding. Because while the participants are left stranded to come up with their own definition of diversity with which to answer the question, Newzoo has this question filed under, to quote, DEI statement, diversity in games is important, end quote. So I have to ask, what is the point of asking the question if the participants don't have the context in which the question is being asked? Why not just make the statement, for example, I am more likely to buy a game that features a protagonist from a marginalized ethnic group. I am more likely to buy a game where at least 50% of the characters express their sexual preferences as non-binary. Agree, neutral, disagree, yada yada yada. So look, there's a sublime beauty in simply being straightforward. It's one of the reasons I don't use a lot of the linguistics tossed around in the culture wars, and in a very basic sense, you should at least be a little wary of people that don't say what they mean or don't offer a definition. Anyways, back to the inclusion framework under help customers being seen, to quote, business impact. 80% of media consumed in the world is created in the US, and yet most media, including video games, don't contain characters and content that align to the broad consumer. Research shows that players prefer to play characters that look like them and are more likely to purchase and play experiences where they align to the character's identity. End quote. Wow, isn't it crazy that the majority of gaming media is targeted in the region that returns the highest profit? I mean, if this is a problem Microsoft cared about, they could start funding game developers based outside of the US in the regions they are implying, but what they are really saying is that people outside of the US could be giving them more money and they want to figure out how to get it. Research does sort of say that players prefer to play as characters that look like them, but not quite. Players tend to create idealized versions of themselves. That's what the studies say. But hold on, I almost always play as a female character with red hair in every game that lets me. That makes me a minority demographic in the gaming space, so why am I being unintentionally excluded by your intentional effort to include? This research on its own should not be taken seriously. Otherwise, what does that say of Winston mains? The truth is that there are a lot of competing variables and factors, and this kind of reductive analysis is not honest market research. Once you dig into the philosophy behind the driving forces, it becomes blatantly obvious that not only is the goal ridiculous and fantastical in scope, but also motivated by identity politics rather than anything to do with gameplay philosophy or what the player base wants. I mean, Stellar Blade is pretty popular, and we are not Korean Maxim models. Let's read on, to quote, 57% of players in the broader gaming market didn't play certain games because the games weren't made for them. Over half of the global gaming market. 53% of developers felt diversity in storytelling should be a priority, and it was ranked at the third most important factor in industry growth. 41% of retail consumers have shifted 10% or more of their business away from brands that do not reflect their value in diversity and inclusion. End quote. How you read things is pretty important. For example, 57% of gamers didn't buy a certain game because they felt it wasn't made for them. I should hope so. What game appeals to 100% of people? It's almost like bemoaning the fact that you don't live in an authoritarian society where everyone thinks the same. 53% of developers, so barely over half of the developers, thought diversity in storytelling should be a priority, and it was overall ranked third. That means there are two other aspects that they felt are more important. Perhaps that should be part of the framework instead. 41% of retail consumers have shifted 10% or more of their business from brands that don't reflect their value in diversity and inclusion. That means that 59% of retail consumers don't care, which is the largest statistic and the largest population measured in any of these bullet points. So look, I don't think that everything in this framework is bad. For example, I think it's good to think about people with disabilities when making a game. Some of my favorite games last year came from a Taiwanese developer, and they were highly political in presentation. So I'm not against an outcome where we see different games, but it really comes down to what is at the heart of it. For example, Red Candle Games, the Taiwanese developer I just mentioned, wanted to make a game about the White Terror because they wanted to give a voice to the people that vanished during that period. They felt that that was important, and that's awesome. It's authentic. It stars its own characters. It's honest. And while I think it's a great game, it's not for everyone. And I'm pretty sure the developers knew that to begin with. Comparatively, Microsoft and its studios, by extension, have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profits. So something like these Taiwanese games that are politically uncomfortable would never make it off the cutting room floor, because it has to be a story for everyone, but also be made for every individual. And so you are only allowed to tackle the more controversial issues when it can be done under the banner of protecting or uplifting a minority. And let's say it like it is. It's the minorities that Americans care about. We aren't going to see one of the 55 minority ethnicities in China represented in an Xbox game. Most gamers aren't talking about Eastern games because they are closet racists. It's more that the planning process for high-budget game creation in the West, as a rule, is a mile wide and an inch deep. And the Xbox Gaming for Everyone and Product Inclusion Framework is a great reminder of how deep an inch actually is. Now, in particular, what incited all the discussion around Stellar Blade are the questions that Xbox wants its developers to ask themselves as self-reflection. To quote, "Are you reinforcing any negative gender stereotypes? Are you unnecessarily introducing gender and gender barriers into your code or design? Are you creating playable female characters that are equal in skill and ability to their male peers? Are your female characters equipped with clothing and armor that fits their tasks? Do they have exaggerated body proportions? When the story allows, do you show male characters who display a full range of emotions, including joy, sadness, and vulnerability? What percent of screen time or screen presence speaking lines heroes is held by different gender racial identities?" End quote. Are your female characters equipped with clothing and armor that suits the task? Stellar Blade would not have made it past Inception under this framework, but also, so what? I mean, well, it's a problem, isn't it? Because Stellar Blade stands in contradiction to the Xbox philosophy, but if Stellar Blade is hugely popular, and it is, then it kind of rings true that a lot of this framework is, well, bullshit. What do you think allows for the highest degree of freedom of expression and diversity? Lots of rules or few rules? If you say lots of rules, then perhaps the Xbox Inclusion Framework is for you. I quoted 2 questions to consider. There are 10 on the page, and there are more than 10 areas, so there is a minimum of 100 questions you need to consider for your game to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And yes, they are framed as suggestions, but is it really a suggestion when it comes from your boss? They wouldn't be there if they didn't want you to follow them. Or I should say, it's great insurance for when you want to distance yourself from one of your studios if they ever cross that line. Now look, I don't care if devs use the framework. Like I said, I will judge a tree by its fruit, but I find it hard to imagine that a checklist of rules based on trying to make everyone happy isn't going to just homogenize video games to the lowest common denominator. So anyways, the Stellar Blade demo came and went. Stellar Blade top pre-orders. Feminists started talking about the male gaze again. See my sexualization and body image video part 2 to find out why you don't need to take people seriously when they start talking about gazes. Reviews came out and they were begrudgingly solid, and finally, when everyone had their say, yes, Stellar Blade has done well. What is remarkable is that this is a new IP by a developer that doesn't have brand appeal within the console market. So while I don't think it's going to be the biggest game this year after the dust settles, it does a good job of building off the Nikkei legacy, and yes, there's a lot of parallels there. But more than that, it sets up a new IP for future developments and also allows for horizontal expansion, and that's a good thing. Everyone wins from this. I mean, what does it say? You can have attractive characters in a game and be well liked. You can make new IPs. You don't need something like the Xbox framework to make good games that are well liked. You can release a game that runs well on launch. I think that one is really understated. There were very few problems on launch outside of the censorship issue. I want to make a point here. Stellar Blade might not be game of the year. It would be cool if it was, but I don't put a lot of stock in that stuff. What's important is that it's likely going to be my favorite game this year. I've been waiting for this game for a long time, and I'm really happy with it. Perhaps I am not the majority, but I think there's a good amount of people that feel the same. I hope that other people get the game they were looking forward to as well. It's not important that I like the game that you like, and it shouldn't matter to me that you don't like the games I like. But if you're going to make some sort of moral proposal as to the damage a game like Stellar Blade does to society, you best come with a study that isn't just thinly veiled radical feminism stuck together with old chewing gum. I said it in part 2, the issue with these perceived conspiracies during Gamergate were not so much the efforts of a cabal as much as it was that games journalists are homogenized by their environment. What is really the difference between Alyssa Mercante and Lee Alexander? When you examine their works and public attitudes, at the end of the day, not much. Both are journalists. Both characterize gamers as white male stereotypes. Both think that the problems with video games stem from the customer. Both are radical feminists. I think the only major difference would stem from the fact that there is more of a focus on race than gender nowadays, but that's a shift within radical feminism itself. And I know what you're thinking. White guy blames feminism. It's hardly flattering, but I think that's why feminism gets away with picking the fights it does. Look, a point is simply a point, but 2 points make a line. The major players in Gamergate are Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian. Isn't it a wild coincidence that Legobutts and Zoe Quinn allegedly DDoS the fine young capitalists together, and then Legobutts ends up on the board of Feminist Frequency alongside Anita Sarkeesian, only to re-emerge in Montreal, Canada at the start of the Sweet Baby Inc. detected incident, where they are once again alongside someone who is trying to cancel someone. In 2019, Zoe Quinn accused an indie developer named Alec Holoka of sexual assault. Alec was immediately fired, and he would take his own life on August 31st, 2019. Now, I think that the most likely explanation is that he did this due to the consequences of the accusation. However, his guilt or innocence will forever remain unknown. I personally feel like this is perhaps the other side of the coin for movements like Me Too, that make you wonder who is the real victim. It's a dilemma, and I don't have an answer outside of due process. But the reason why we're talking about this is because Alec was the co-founder of his studio, Infinite Ammo. Alec's sister, Eileen Holoka, is now in control of Infinite Ammo. Eileen Holoka runs 2 other companies, Weird Ghosts and Baby Ghosts. I'm going to read you her bio from Weird Ghosts. To quote, Weird Ghosts was born from a collective desire to empower structurally excluded game devs. Our ultimate goal is a funding landscape in Canada that truly supports game studios at all stages so that all can grow and thrive. Eileen Mary Holoka, General Partner. Eileen. She is a queer and disabled white settler living on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. They are a writer, game dev, and community organizer advocate with a background in theater, games, poetry, and health communications. They have a PhD in communication studies from Concordia University and have published extensively within and outside of academia. They are a co-founder of both Weird Ghosts and Baby Ghosts with Jenny Robinson Faber, as well as a member of Gamma Space Collaborative Studio. They also work as the general manager of Infinite Ammo. End quote. So here's how this works. To quote, studio support, not just project funding. Weird Ghosts invests in founders that want to build profitable, impact-oriented studios with a long-term vision and commitment to equitable, worker-centric structures. How we fund. We believe in creators retaining ownership of their companies and IP. Our investments are structured around shared earnings so that we recoup only after your team is paid. Grants. For teams who want to form a co-op, get studio operations up and running, and get support with impact strategy. Prepares teams for further fundraising, now administered through Baby Ghosts. Investment for more established teams and Baby Ghosts alumni with a project in any stage of development allows key personnel to focus full-time on studio development. End quote. So when we go over to Baby Ghosts, we can see that the money is backed by Clever Endeavor, the makers of Ultimate Chicken Horse, Infinite Ammo, and Gamma Space, which is also supported by a Canadian government program. The way it works is that you get in contact with Weird Ghosts, you tell them that you are from a marginalized group and that you want to make a video game. They then funnel you to the Baby Ghosts grant, you then interface with Baby Ghosts and go into their mentorship program to get access to the funding. And do you know who went through this process? That's right, Sweet Baby Inc. Now to me, that's a crazy amount of coincidences. Not only do you have connections between Lego Butts, Zoe Quinn, and Anita Sarkeesian, but Zoe Quinn accuses a guy with a studio of something bad, and then when he dies, the earnings and royalties are funneled into a program run by his sister that then pays for the launch of Sweet Baby Inc., which also happens to be Lego Butts' place of employment. Now, I want to be clear here, I am not implying that this is somehow planned. That would be insane. Rather, what I am implying is that radical feminism is the common denominator between Gamergate in 2014 and 2024. And not only is it a common denominator, but it is also incestuously insular in the gaming space, with a single person that is present at every point of the controversy over a span of 10 years. I mean, what are the odds? Again, I'm not saying that Lego Butts is somehow responsible, but at what point do we apply Occam's razor and think, yeah, you know what? Maybe this belief system incentivizes bad actors that ultimately do not produce the fruit that they say they do. Can you really say that you want inclusion when your entire belief system suckles on the lifeblood of division? And I guess the real question is, when will it be sated? I think the answer you will get is when all opposing ideologies have been eliminated. Ironic, I think, that when you follow radical feminism to its logical conclusion, the end goal is not to unite people of different demographics in any authentic way, but rather to eliminate the ultimate minority, the individual. I want to walk back a moment and readdress what I said in the first video. I don't think that feminism as a whole is unsalvageable. At its very core, I support it when it engages in egalitarian efforts that have transparent, objective outcomes and realistic goals that take everyone into consideration. As soon as you need a special dictionary to understand it though, it's a mess. And I think that's what the echo chamber is. The definitions are fluid enough that you can be a seething racist or sexist on parade, but not enough that it stands up to scientific scrutiny or in court. So let's sum it up. Games journalism is a left-leaning echo chamber that gatekeeps challenging ideologies. Radical feminism has become the de facto left representation of egalitarianism in the gaming space because it is the most aggressive and further reinforces the structure of the echo chamber. Game developers are also a majority of left-leaning individuals. Games journalism and the gaming industry have a symbiotic and corrupt business relationship that excludes the customer and so encourages people within that space to cross-travel between the two. Because game developers and games journalists are allied in such a way, when there is a dispute, it will always result in games journalism and the games industry aligning under the banner of left politics, and once pressure is applied, these left politics always reveal themselves to be radical feminists. So what is the answer? I don't know, but I'm going to go and play Stellar Blade. Catch you later.